As the English colonies took root and began to flourish along the Atlantic coast, the settlers started to develop their own systems of governance and their own sense of identity. In Virginia in 1619, the same momentous year that saw the arrival of the first enslaved Africans and the landing of the Mayflower Pilgrims to the north, something else remarkable happened that would shape the future of American democracy. The Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the English colonies. The word burgess comes from the old term for a citizen of a borough or town, and these burgesses were representatives elected by the colonists themselves to meet and make laws for the colony. The first session convened in a church in Jamestown on July 30th, 1619, with 22 burgesses representing 11 plantations and settlements. They met for just 5 or 6 days, but in that short time, they established a precedent that would echo through American history. The Assembly passed laws on tobacco prices, penalties for laziness, and relations with native peoples. They also petitioned the Virginia Company on various grievances. Though the British Crown and the governor retained significant power and could veto legislation, the House of Burgesses gave colonists a voice in their own governance, a taste of self-rule that they would be increasingly reluctant to give up. Over the decades, this assembly would become a training ground for political leadership, and the idea of representative government would spread to other colonies. When revolution eventually came, many of the founding fathers had cut their political teeth in colonial assemblies, just like this one, learning the arts of debate, compromise, and the crafting of legislation. The House of Burgesses planted a seed, the idea that those who lived in a place should have a say in how that place was governed, an idea that would eventually grow into a forest of democratic institutions. But while colonists were establishing their own assemblies, they were still very much part of the British Empire, and Britain had very specific ideas about what colonies were for. Many British policymakers and colonists alike believed in an economic theory called mercantilism. According to mercantilist thinking, the wealth of a nation was measured primarily by the amount of gold and silver it possessed, and the best way to accumulate that wealth was through a favorable balance of trade, exporting more than you imported. Colonies played a crucial role in this system. They were meant to provide raw materials to the mother country, materials like timber for ships, tobacco, rice, and indigo that Britain could use or re-export for profit. In return, the colonies would buy manufactured goods from Britain, creating a closed economic loop that enriched the empire. The colonies were not supposed to develop their own manufacturing or trade freely with other nations. That would defeat the purpose. Everything was designed to benefit Britain's economy and fill Britain's treasury. The colonists, of course, had their own economic interests, and these didn't always align with what was good for Britain. They wanted to trade with whoever offered the best prices, to manufacture their own goods when it made sense, and to keep the profits of their labor. This fundamental tension between the imperial economic system and colonial self-interest would simmer for decades, occasionally boiling over into conflict, and eventually contributing to the revolutionary break with Britain. Mercantilism created an empire, but it also created the conditions for that empire's fracture. To enforce mercantilist policies, the British Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts, beginning in the 1650s and continuing through the colonial period. These acts were designed to channel colonial trade through Britain and British ships, ensuring that the mother country got its cut of the profits. Under these laws, certain colonial goods, called enumerated commodities, could only be shipped to Britain or other British colonies, not directly to foreign markets. These included valuable products like tobacco, sugar, rice, and later, naval stores like tar and turpentine. Even if a colonial merchant could get a better price in France or Spain, they were forbidden from selling there. Additionally, European goods destined for the colonies had to pass through British ports first, where they could be taxed. Ships carrying colonial goods generally had to be British-built and crewed mostly by British or colonial sailors. These regulations effectively taxed the colonists indirectly through trade restrictions rather than direct internal taxes. For many years, the colonists grumbled, but largely accepted this system, partly because enforcement was often lax, and partly because they still identified as British subjects. The Navigation Acts shaped the colonial economy, directing investment into certain crops and industries while discouraging others. They made some colonists wealthy, particularly those involved in the triangle trade or in producing enumerated goods, while frustrating others who chafed under the restrictions. The Acts also fostered a sense that British policy was designed to benefit Britain at colonial expense, a grievance that would grow louder as the 18th century progressed, and Britain began trying to enforce these laws more strictly and add new taxes on top of them. While economic and political structures were being established, English colonists were also deeply engaged in the project of converting native peoples to Christianity. In New England, Puritan missionaries established what they called praying Indian towns, also known as praying towns, where native people who converted to Christianity could live in English-style settlements, learn English customs, and be instructed in Puritan theology. The first and most famous of these was Natick, established in 1651 by missionary John Eliot near Boston. At their peak, there were 14 praying towns in Massachusetts with thousands of native residents. The converts, called praying Indians, were expected to adopt English-style clothing, housing, agriculture, and governance, essentially abandoning their traditional ways of life. In return, they received some legal protections and were supposedly safe from enslavement. John Eliot even translated the Bible into the Algonquian language, a remarkable linguistic achievement. But these communities existed in a precarious position, caught between two worlds, and fully accepted by neither. English colonists often distrusted them, seeing them as potential spies or enemies. Traditional native peoples sometimes viewed them as traitors who had abandoned their culture. During King Philip's War in the 1670s, a devastating conflict between New England colonists and native peoples, the praying Indians suffered terribly. Many were rounded up and confined to bleak internment camps on harbor islands, where they suffered from cold, starvation, and disease. Their loyalty to the English was rewarded with suspicion and imprisonment. After the war, the praying towns never fully recovered. Some were disbanded, others dwindled as residents left or died. By the 18th century, most had failed or been absorbed. The experiment revealed the enormous cultural chasm between native and English societies and the painful reality that conversion often meant cultural destruction, with converts expected to completely abandon their identity rather than synthesize the two traditions. As the colonies matured, Through the late 1600s and into the 1700s, the institution of slavery became increasingly entrenched and racialized. In 1705, Virginia passed a comprehensive set of slave codes that hardened racial slavery in law and created a rigid racial hierarchy. These codes defined who was a slave, what rights they did not have, and what punishments could be inflicted on them. The laws stated explicitly that all servants imported who were not Christians in their native country would be slaves, with their status passing to their children, but that baptism as a Christian did not bring freedom. The codes gave masters enormous power over enslaved people, allowing them to administer brutal punishments with little fear of legal consequences. If an enslaved person died while being punished, the master could not be charged with murder. The codes also created a clear legal distinction between white and black people, prohibiting interracial marriage and sexual relations, and stripping free black people of many rights, including the right to hold office or testify against white people in court. These laws served a dual purpose. They protected the economic interests of slaveholders by ensuring that their human property remained firmly under their control, and they also worked to prevent alliances between poor whites and enslaved or free black people. By giving even the poorest white person a higher legal status than any black person, the laws created a racial caste system that helped maintain social order and prevented class-based unity among the lower classes. The Virginia slave codes became a model for other southern colonies and states, and they established legal and social structures that would persist for centuries. They transformed slavery from a labor system that had once had some ambiguity into a permanent, hereditary, race-based institution that defined people by the color of their skin and denied them their humanity under the law. With so many restrictive laws and economic regulations, it should come as no surprise that many colonists found ways around them. Smuggling became widespread throughout the colonies, as merchants dodged British trade laws to maximize their profits. Coastal towns and harbors were perfect for illicit trade, with countless coves, inlets, and rivers where ships could quietly load and unload cargo away from the eyes of customs officials. Colonial merchants smuggled in molasses from the French West Indies to make rum, avoiding the taxes they would have paid on British molasses. They traded directly with European countries, cutting out British middlemen. They underreported the value of goods, or simply failed to declare them at all. Even respectable merchants engaged in smuggling, viewing it not as crime, but as legitimate business in the face of unjust laws. Port officials were often underpaid and open to bribes, and even when they tried to enforce the law, juries of local colonists were reluctant to convict their neighbors. Smuggling became so common that it was almost normalized, part of the economic fabric of colonial life. This widespread disregard for British trade laws fostered a culture of resistance to imperial control and a belief that unjust laws need not be obeyed. It created networks of merchants and sailors who were practiced in evading authority and who had financial interests in opposing British regulation. When Britain later tried to crack down on smuggling and enforce trade laws more strictly in the 1760s, including through the use of rights of assistance that allowed customs officials to search any building for smuggled goods, the colonists reacted with outrage. They saw it as tyranny, an invasion of their rights. But from the British perspective, they were simply trying to enforce laws that had been on the books for decades. smuggling had created a shadow economy and a culture of defiance that would contribute directly to the revolutionary movement. The tensions between Britain and its colonies were complicated further by a massive conflict that engulfed much of the world in the mid-18th century. In North America, it was called the French and Indian War, though it was part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. The war lasted from 1754 to 1763 and pitted Britain and its colonies against France and its native allies, with both sides fighting for control of the Ohio Valley and the vast interior of the continent. The war began with skirmishes on the frontier, including a young George Washington leading Virginia militia into a disastrous engagement at Fort Necessity. It escalated into a major conflict with professional armies, naval battles, and campaigns that stretched from the forests of Pennsylvania to the walls of Quebec. Native peoples fought on both sides, though many sided with France, which had generally pursued a more cooperative relationship with native nations based on trade and alliance rather than mass settlement. The war was brutal and expensive, with thousands dying in battle, from disease or in raids on frontier settlements. Britain eventually prevailed, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 reshaped the map of North America. France ceded nearly all of its North American territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain, as well as its claims to lands in Canada. Spain, which had allied with France, gave Florida to Britain, but received Louisiana from France as compensation. The British Empire had never been larger, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Britain had accumulated massive debts fighting the war, debts that British politicians believed the colonies should help pay since the war had been fought partly to defend them. This led directly to new taxes and policies that would outrage the colonists, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. The French and Indian War removed France as a power in North America, but it also removed one of the main reasons colonists felt they needed British protection. With the French threat gone, many colonists began to question why they needed British troops on their soil at all, especially when they were being asked to pay for them. The war had also given many colonists, including officers like George Washington, military experience and confidence. Ironically, Britain's greatest imperial victory set the stage for the loss of its most valuable colonies. All of this conflict and competition was driven largely by economic concerns, and at the heart of the colonial economy were natural resources. 3 commodities in particular shaped the early colonial experience: beavers, cod, and tobacco. We've already discussed the beaver fur trade and how it shaped relationships and conflicts across the northern colonies and the interior. Cod was equally important, particularly for New England. The Grand Bands of Newfoundland were some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, teeming with cod that could be caught, salted, dried, and shipped across the Atlantic. Dried cod was a staple food in Catholic Europe, where meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent, creating enormous demand. New England fishermen built an industry around cod, and the fish became so important to the Massachusetts economy that a carved wooden cod, the sacred cod, was hung in the State House and remains there to this day. Cod fishing created wealth, built shipbuilding industries, and gave New England merchants the capital they needed to invest in other ventures, including the triangle trade. Tobacco was the economic engine of the Chesapeake colonies, particularly Virginia and Maryland. After John Rolfe successfully cultivated a hybrid strain of tobacco that was smoother and more palatable to European tastes, Virginia's economy exploded. Tobacco was literally used as currency for a time. Debts were paid in pounds of tobacco, and fines and fees were calculated in tobacco. The crop was so profitable that colonists grew it everywhere, even in the streets of Jamestown. But tobacco quickly exhausted the soil, requiring ever more land, which drove expansion into native territories and fueled conflict. It also created a demand for labor that would be filled increasingly by enslaved Africans as the 17th century progressed. These three commodities, beaver pelts from the forests, cod from the sea, and tobacco from the fields, built the colonial economy and funded the growth of colonial society. They connected the colonies to global trade networks and made fortunes for some, while demanding the labor and displacement of many others. As the 18th century progressed and colonial society became more established, colonists were exposed to new ideas flowing from Europe, particularly from the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason, science, and the power of human intellect to understand and improve the world. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu wrote about natural rights, the social contract, and the separation of powers in government. John Locke argued that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments derived their legitimate authority from the consent of the governed. If a government violated those natural rights, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. These were revolutionary ideas, challenging the traditional notions of divine right monarchy and absolute authority. Books and pamphlets circulating these ideas made their way across the Atlantic and were eagerly read by educated colonists. Colonial newspapers reprinted essays by Enlightenment thinkers. Young men at colleges like Harvard, Yale, and the College of William and Mary studied these works and debated their implications. The Enlightenment gave colonists an intellectual framework for understanding their grievances against Britain and for imagining an alternative political order. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was drawing directly on Enlightenment philosophy, particularly Locke's ideas. When the founders designed a government with separation of powers, checks and balances, and a Bill of Rights, they were putting Enlightenment principles into practice. These ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and limited government would not only inspire the American Revolution, but would continue to shape American political thought and influence revolutionary movements around the world for generations to come. But colonial life wasn't all high-minded philosophy and political theory. The colonies, particularly the port cities, had a rougher, more adventurous side. Cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston were bustling, diverse, sometimes dangerous places where sailors, merchants, enslaved people, indentured servants, and free artisans mixed together. And these cities were notorious for their connections to piracy. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, known as the Golden Age of piracy, pirates prowled the Atlantic and Caribbean, attacking merchant ships, Spanish treasure fleets, and even entire towns. Some of the most famous pirates in history operated during this era, including Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach. Blackbeard was a terrifying figure, tall and imposing, with a long black beard that he reportedly braided and tied with ribbons. In battle, he would stick slow-burning fuses under his hat so that smoke wreathed his head, making him look demonic. In 1718, Blackbeard sailed his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, into the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina, and blockaded the city for nearly a week. He captured several ships and took prominent hostages, including a member of the Colonial Council. His demand was not for gold or jewels, but for medicine, specifically a chest of medical supplies for his crew, many of whom were suffering from disease. The terrified city complied, and Blackbeard sailed away, eventually meeting his end later that year in a battle with Royal Navy forces off the coast of North Carolina. Pirates like Blackbeard were both criminals and, in some ways, entrepreneurs operating outside the law. Many pirates had started as privateers, sailors commissioned by governments to attack enemy ships during wartime, but who turned to piracy when the wars ended and they needed income. Colonial authorities had a complicated relationship with pirates. Officially, they condemned piracy and hanged captured pirates. But unofficially, many merchants and even some colonial governors traded with pirates, buying the stolen goods at low prices and selling them supplies. Pirates brought Spanish silver and exotic goods into colonial ports, stimulating local economies. Some retired pirates settled in colonial towns and became respectable citizens. The notorious Captain William Kidd, for example, was a wealthy merchant and privateer who lived in New York before his controversial turn to piracy and eventual execution in London. The pirate era eventually ended as navies cracked down and colonial governments could no longer afford to turn a blind eye. But for a time, pirates were a colorful, dangerous part of colonial life, symbols of the rough, unruly, and opportunistic spirit of the age.